Ceará Global 2020, The Future in 360 Degrees, an event that deals with foreign investments and foreign trade and international cooperation, brought to you by Chamber of Commerce and Foreign Investments, Brazil and Portugal Chamber of Commerce in Ceará, sponsorship from ADESE, AECIP, APSV Advogados, House of Representatives of the State of Ceará, BF Fortship, Banco do Nordeste, Bugaboo Studio, Café Santa Clara, FIEC, QUER, Sebrae Ceará, SP Combustíveis, and Fortaleza University, Unifor, Edson Queiroz Foundation. Co-sponsorship from Secretariat of Tourism of the State of Ceará. Support from Casa Azul Ventures, Elephant Co-working, the Federation of the Chambers of Commerce, Brazil Africa Institute, JUSEC Ceará, Mango Ventures, Observatory France, Trends CE, Vetor Brands and Patents, Wins for Future, institutional support from ABAX Brasil, FEComércio Ceará, and Complexo PECEM, technological support from Mob Telecom, iProject TI, organized by Prática Eventos and Move On. Media partner, Grupo O Povo. Ceará Global 2020. The Future in 360 Degrees, our third and last day of our program. And now we have the panel, Taxation and Tax Breaks. What can investors expect in Ceará? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone who is watching us. It's a great satisfaction to be a mediator, Luis Cavalcante. I'm a tax lawyer at APSV Advogados. I'm also doing my master's in tax law, taxation, to try to improve tax relationships. And today we have Dr. Sérgio Melo, a reference here in the state of Ceará in terms of tax law, and who's going to share with us some ideas, and also Carlos Oliveira, has a lot of experience also in tax law, and has a lot to contribute in this debate. And so without any further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Sérgio Melo to share his ideas with us, and then Carlos Oliveira, and after, just a quick debate about the new ideas regarding this topic. So please, Dr. Sérgio Melo, go ahead. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope that everyone that will participate in this event will take advantage a little bit of our experience and some of our comments. Of course, this discussion is quite lengthy, but what points can we use to guide us here? I would say that the discussion of tax reform that we've been hearing for a long time now, and I personally participated in two tax reforms, 2003 and 2008, representing the Federal Council of Accounting, together with a parliamentary group of tax studies from the National Congress. So in 2003 and 2008, the discussions were quite heated. At that time, we had many public hearings to discuss so many details and many issues, but always we got stuck on the issue that somebody will come out winning and somebody will come out losing. Those that come out winning don't want to give up anything, and the reforms just didn't happen. Personally, I think we should discuss in Brazil thinking about some important points. Brazil has today 50% of the national GDP in tax discussions, administrative level, and others. I mean, here we're talking about 3 trillion reais, where Brazil is going through many tax problems, and nobody really knows what are the correct procedures that need to be adopted, given the thousands of existing standards, and that change as each day goes by. So, to deal with this kind of thing, there's no other alternative. We need to reform taxation in Brazil. This reform could go through two phases, as I see it. One, by changing laws, changing what's possible without changing the Constitution. And secondly, what really requires a change in Constitution. So to change the Constitution, and with this, we would have major breakthroughs, reducing the quantity of work, hundreds and thousands of hours that you lose during the year, in order to check taxes, inform the taxes, so many obligations that imposes taxpayers to do. And so we could try and simplify all of this. Many changes in our laws that would bring about a certain operational facility that would reduce conflict and the numbers of hours in tax administration. And of course, other things that are important that should be discussed. Today we have APEC 45 and 110. APEC 45 tries to reduce 9 taxes, different taxes, to try and simplify bringing together different taxes in Brazil. Fuel tax, added value tax. Anyway, an important solution, of course. Many taxes, perhaps where we charge just one single tax. Now, 110 reduces import tax and others. Now, it's important reducing 5 or 9. The detail is that we want to simplify. Simplification can bring about many benefits. We're going to face problems, of course, distribution of tax collection, but that's a problem that we can't discuss right now. Now, when I look at the tax burden, this huge tax burden, and when we think about international business, be it international business when we talk about exports or international business from the point of view of imports, be it operations of joint ventures, operations where national companies and foreign companies will cooperate, and then the problem is even greater because the legislation depends on what state you're in. How you're going to do these imports. Although federal taxes, import taxes, and other import taxes are federal, but we have the state level of taxes. Anyway, not to have to discuss all of these operational issues, what I would like to share here, talking about federal taxes, is that we have a huge quantity of taxes, okay? And it's a huge challenge to overcome these difficulties, and this is not good for business. So, this inhibits international operations in Brazil, inhibits export operations, and operations together between Brazilian companies and foreign companies to do business together. And so, a tax is a major weight in our economy, and we need to unlock, if you will, this major problem that we call taxes in Brazil, mainly when we talk about international business. Now, regarding the advantages, the benefits, they exist. Companies, Brazilian companies located in the north and northeast of Brazil, they have a federal incentive, which is the reduction of income tax in 75%, and also reinvestments. So the 25% that's left over to pay, since you reduce 75%, on these 25%, you still have the right to reduce another 30% of the 25% for reinvestments in your own projects, which is a rule that anybody can obtain through Sudeni's website. Now, locally speaking, okay, considering state taxes, we have different tax breaks and incentives in Ceará. The most common tax break, the one that's most widely used, is FTI, used by industry, but also commerce and trade can use this through imports, and also only to tax with a reduced base. So you could have up to 75% of reduction of those sales that go out of the state that happens through this PCDN program, which is another tax break that can be provided. Now, there are other incentives like PROAGI that also allow that certain industries, certain companies can obtain these tax breaks for renewable energies. Anyway, there are many incentives that definitely encourage companies that are outside of the state to come here and encourage local companies to develop themselves, to grow, to modernize, and from there obtain these tax breaks at a state level, which is very relevant, and that's one of the reasons why there are many companies are coming to the state of Ceará attracted by these tax breaks. Now, something that is notorious, whatever is the tax reform that will come, we're going to face a problem with tax breaks, local tax breaks. For any state in Brazil, North, Northeast, the Midwest, South or Southeast, it doesn't matter. We're going to have major problems with many of these tax breaks because changing some of these taxes, no longer having some taxes, the modeling of the taxes will be different, and we're going to have to reinvent ourselves regarding tax breaks. I think we can change tax breaks to have economic breaks, which would be different. It would be seen differently, preferably through direct investments, not under the custody of the state, but a program of investment development with resources from third parties, private resources, and resources even from international agencies like IFC, the financial arm of the World Bank. And so we could have a new model of tax breaks, if you will, attraction of investments, not only with the current model, because the current model it will perhaps disappear because of the changes in the law that will come. Regardless of the reforms, we're going to have problems with tax breaks, and it's almost impossible to have a rupture of these incentives in regions that are not as so good like in the Northeast. So we're going to need a lot of creativity to change a lot of these tax breaks because of economic incentives and an investment fund and participations where ADESE can help out, can be a major partner of this fund. The legislation that created ADESE allows for ADESE to participate in the fund, that ADESE could directly participate. Participation in the fund seems to be quite important because it's not only the money that takes care of the problem of industry or an economic activity. You need governance, you need corporate governance, and a fund could provide that. Not only in the necessary investments to work with these activities, but also receive support from adequate management. And corporate governance will give us the possibility of working better in the market, understanding and using financial resources that are applied. And so I think we have, in terms of taxes, this scenario that I talk to you very quickly. In terms of international business, we need to create an export culture. Brazil is a very small country regarding trade. We know that the sum of what you import versus what you export, Brazil is only 141st country in the world in this trade balance. Brazil only has 24% of GDP, which is very small. For a country so important as Brazil, with the dimensions of Brazil, with a GDP of 1.7 trillion US dollars. And so we need, to unlock this. We need a lot of creativity. We have, for example, small and medium-sized companies that could focus in the international market, but alone it's impossible. Ideally, you need to have unity of these companies through a coordination, perhaps through SEBRAE and export consortiums, and creating production units that can complement each other and will create products that have a capacity to compete abroad and that can go international. Going international is what many countries in the world have done. Many countries in the world live because of their exports. A small country like Portugal, 97% of their GDP, 97% of their trade, 97%. I know this is kind of confusing. So imports and exports, 97% of the GDP. So anyway, it's extremely important that this happen, but we have many obstacles, many hurdles in Brazil. In Brazil, you only have the right to these tax breaks. You can't be taxed on the way out of the last one that exports, but the one that sells raw materials, that sells packaging materials for the company that will export, they're taxed when actually they could be taxed like in the rest of the world. But these products are less because they don't have these taxes. And so intensify the willingness of companies and people to get into the international market. And so you need to make this easy and not like it happens in Brazil, obstacles from everywhere. And of course, taxes, but all of the rest is very difficult to overcome the bureaucratic hurdles, all of the red tape we have. So all of this needs to be eliminated. Example of a exporting consortium that could bring about something new in the international market. For those that don't know the international market, because it's also not that easy, but we have the International Business Center from FIEC that can do and has been doing excellent work, but we need to do more. You need to show Brazilian business community that to go international is a gateway to the world with many opportunities. And so generally speaking, these are my observations to get the ball rolling, and I'd like to hear from my colleagues, and at the end, our debate. Yes, Mr. Carlos Oliveira, ABAX audit consulting company that works here in the north and northeast of Brazil, especially with taxation. So first I'd like to thank the invitation through Ceará Global and the organizers to take part in this very important event. So thank you very much. It's a great honor to participate and congratulate Dr. Sérgio Melo, a renowned tax lawyer. Brilliant presentation. You really said it all, And actually, I don't have that much to say, I guess, that much to add. But anyway, congratulations, Dr. Sérgio Melo. That's exactly what I expected. And so starting, like we heard, we really are going through a scenario of a lot of tax complexity, if you will. And so we're going through a scenario, more than 700,000 tax standards. I mean, it's a complexity, it's a volume and extension that you don't see anywhere else in the world of taxation. Like Tom Jobim says, Brazil is not for beginners. Okay, Brazil is really not for beginners, and especially when we talk about taxes, that's true. I mean, Brazil, in tax terms, is really not for beginners. It's very complex and very vast, which brings about a need for you to not only have a great team with tax lawyers, tax planning, a team that works with compliance and can plan within your organization, but also audits and consulting services from lawyers, tax lawyers. Anyway, that's the scenario in Brazil. It's even part of the Brazil cost, as it were. But that's what taxes are all about. There's something that somebody said that the only thing we have certain in the world is death and taxes. You just can't run away from death and taxes. That's the context that we find ourselves in. So, the topic at hand, we can think from a legal standpoint, which is to have a whole debate from a point of view of tax breaks and all of the legal insecurity because of the tax wars that are going on. This is something that we hear a lot about at the federal level. The tax war, the war between the ports, where each state has their own tax breaks to try and attract investments to their own state. And there's a huge legal debate about that. But that won't be the focus here. Otherwise, it'll be too legal. Also, we could think about the political economic context and to say, about what tax breaks bring about and the loss of collection of taxes for the government. And so this calculation of less taxes levied, but also tax breaks, and expanding the base so that everybody could be taxed from an economic political standpoint. What is the most advantageous? What would be ideal? I mean, that's a whole other discussion. That's more political, philosophical in taxation, and that's not the idea to cover here, although it is an interesting topic to discuss. So, what am I going to share with you here in this little time that we have, actually? I'm going to try and talk about more tax breaks. Those of you that are listening to us, that are watching us, thinking, well, I might be going to Brazil, I want to invest, I want to expand. What am I going to find there? That's actually a question that we hear a lot with foreign investors when they come. They ask, what is taxation like in Brazil? And we start explaining, well, there are different types of taxation, but there's IST, each municipality has their own legislation, each state has their own legislation. At the federal level, you have PIS and COFINS. These are two taxes, but they're really the same. Income tax, there's social contribution. Anyway, all of this really generates a lot of confusion for investors. This alphabet soup of different taxes, and really it's very confusing. And recently, Minister Paulo Guedes talked a lot about this. So we are in a situation where it's difficult to explain to investors all of this. And now talking about tax breaks, since this has already been mentioned very well by Sérgio, what we have is this. Tax breaks, we can separate them by different natures, if you will. First, we have tax breaks that are given depending on the region that the company is going to install themselves in. If the company wants to install themselves in the north or northeast, there are some tax breaks that are specific for these regions. Okay, we're talking about Sudene, that's very well known from the 70s, with Celso Furtado, to try and decrease social inequalities, and it's still in force. A decrease in income tax. So that's one thing that happens in the northeast of Brazil. And it depends also on the type of business, those that are priority. So that alone is already a great competitive advantage for any industry in the northeast. Of course, for this, you have to come up with an economic project and show the feasibility of your project. Once you do this, you'll be able to obtain the tax break for 10 years, or perhaps even you can renew and expand. It'll depend on your structure. Now, another thing, due to the region, specifically talking about the Northeast, is talking about Ceará, actually. This was mentioned by Dr. Sérgio, FDI Provim. It's a tax break also from the 70s, and very well known by many industries, Vulcabras, Grandene, Gerdau, major industry that have installed here trying to obtain this tax break. And it could be 75% of value-added tax, all the way to 99%, depending on the case. And so you can see that this is very relevant, decreasing these taxes 75 to 99% of ICMS tax. It's financed, but after some time, and so the final tax burden of ICMS is reduced in 56, depending on the type of taxation. So excellent results, not only tax results, but economic results, because tax represents, the government won't collect this tax. The company pays less. But as this converts into a subvention, ICMS that doesn't exist, and a subvention for investments, and as revenue. And so this improves the economic results. This creates profits, but these profits cannot be distributed as dividends to shareholders or business partners. However, it improves the profits of the company, the indicators of the company. Anyway, this is an important point to be highlighted in terms of FD Provin, as it brings about the economic effects of ICMS, and also is interesting for the profits of the company. And another aspect is that it's not used as the basis of calculation. The ICMS shouldn't be taxed by other federal taxes, like income tax, PIS/COFINS, etc. So the part of ICMS that's not taxed through this tax break shouldn't be taxed by other federal taxes. So anyway, that's also a point. And this was highly debated. My colleagues that are here with me know this very well. Sérgio for sure knows a lot about this. And so this is something that's quite mature, especially after the new law that amplified this case. So we have FD Provin, Sudene, and most recently, ZPE, another local incentive. And so this, for sure, is a region, like a free trade zone, where export companies can install and really have less tax burden, especially federal taxes, in a very interesting way. You know that it's still quite modest, the number of companies in the ZPE, but we have a steel mill, we have Phoenix, and other companies that are installing in the ZPE. Those that are exporting companies, this for sure is a great tax break. Now, besides regions, okay, so just as a function of the region, the company will find excellent tax breaks, seja Sudene, FDE, or ZPE, just the fact that it's Ceará or the Northeast. But we also have other incentives, other tax breaks that are linked to different activities, different industry, or different products. So you can see that our tax breaks, because a tax break really is a tax exemption. You don't have to pay the tax, or a reduction. You have a reduction of the tax, or compensation. I mean, you gain credits to compensate with other taxes. So that's really what a tax break truly is to exempt, to reduce, or to obtain credits, so that after you can deduct from other taxes. Well, regarding sectors, activities, or products, we also have specific incentives. For example, in construction and development, we have different investments from Portugal, from Italy, from Spain to work in construction. And so we have a hedge, which is a special tax regime. The special tax regime allows 4% on the net revenues of the company. It's a great encouragement and you can use this incentive. Minha Casa Minha Vida can be 1%. And so anyway, it's a reduced tax burden. We also have in IT, and we don't know if that's going to continue or not, how much this represents for the government. And so this is something that still exists, and so it's an interesting tax break. In agribusiness, there are a whole bunch of different things. Agribusiness, besides those that I already mentioned, FDI and Sudene, you can also have tax breaks on payroll, for example. And so agribusiness, besides the products themselves that are almost all exempt or you pay less on sales, agribusiness also counts with many of these tax breaks. Now, when we look at wholesale or importers, we also have the reduction in the calculations for many products. We have carga líquida for wholesalers that generates a reduction in the tax burden. Anyway, you start to see that for each sector, it's important to see if that sector, if that industry, depending on the region, you could also have tax breaks that are specific, such as the case for wholesalers, food, agribusiness, freight forwarders, transportation companies. Anyway, and the product, because each product has its taxation DNA. And you can see that sometimes there are excellent tax breaks in that sense. Well, so besides the region and the activity, we also have the company size. Depending on the revenue, depending on the size of the company, there are extra tax breaks. For example, the Simples, because of the tax reforms that worked in the past. Everardo Maciel, who used to say this, it's 8 taxes joined into one. So today, it's not that simple. But anyway, even so, it's something that simplifies taxation. Lucro presumido, those that have revenues up to 78 million, it's also simplified. So here we're talking just about the company's size, about the revenue. After, we see tax breaks for different needs that the government wants to encourage to attract business. For example, R&D, research and development. So anything that's linked to research and development, there are tax breaks, be it in income tax or whatever. Those that want to modernize their products or processes, you can request, and then there's the possibility of having tax breaks in income tax or other taxes. Everything that you invest in R&D. Also, the informatics law, the Rouanet law, those projects that are geared towards arts, culture, audiovisual, for the elderly. Anyway, these are specific tax breaks that the government provides so that the company can mobilize to help, to encourage certain activities, and also to obtain tax benefits. So these are important incentives because really they represent a reduction in taxes. Anyway, these are different incentives, different tax breaks for different sectors and industry. But going back to a point that was already alluded to by Dr. Sérgio regarding tax reforms, all of this needs to be revisited. I mean, as we go towards a new context of tax reforms, what happens throughout the world? I mean, everybody, with value-added tax or even other countries that don't have our level of GDP are going towards VAT or VAT. And so it's also important for us to go in this direction. Example of what happened in the past when Brazil was aligned with IFRS, International Accounting Laws. And so it's the same language with what the rest of the world is doing, IFRS. And we need to do the same thing with taxes, a world standard with value-added tax and not our excessive taxing on consumption, the same consumption basis. And, we need to become a competitive player in the world stage, just like other countries. So the way that we are today, we're going to continue with ICMS and this tax war, because the project from Minister Paulo Guedes talks about PIS/COFINS, but not ICMS tax. Now, SEFAZ, this one, yes. This one, there is a proposal where there's a broader context. Here we're talking about all of the taxes being unified into one. In the case of Paulo Guedes, he's just proposing PIS and COFINS. I understand that PEC 45 project that's more advanced and being discussed has a lot more to do with the need of Brazil for a tax reform. Of course, it's bolder, it's more dramatic than what Paulo Guedes is trying to go in steps. But anyway, there's a universal basis, taxation that's a lot more simplified, perhaps taxing men less. And anyway, as I see it, this project that's in Congress needs to dialogue with others, especially CZF PEC 45. Well, and so I think we can perhaps go to the questions. We already talked a lot about incentives, tax reforms, and perhaps we can go to the questions to go to our debate. Yes, excellent. And, basically, I'm just mediating these two experts in tax law. I came up with a couple of ideas here during your presentations. We know tax benefits, this has always been very controversial. To what extent the government, that really needs resources now, the government could give up more tax revenue, but of course, we need to create jobs and income, and we know that this is very difficult. If Brazil can still expand its tax benefits, be it for the state of Ceará or at a federal level. Now, another point that I would like to hear from you guys is regarding to what extent tax reforms would provide these tax benefits, because they're used to decrease regional inequalities, to try and balance the states out. So to continue bringing investments to the state of Ceará, which is a state that geographically is privileged, in detriment of like São Paulo, and how the tax reform could impact this. Some situations where in the new tax reform. Now, another thing is the issue of the guarantees. To what extent investors have guarantees so that these tax breaks aren't removed immediately? These guarantees have been respected. I mean, once they're given, they're respected all the way until the end. I mean, these are some issues that I'd like to hear from you. Perhaps Sérgio first. Yeah, that's an important question. It's a very encompassing question. Since I said something in the beginning, I don't know if you remember, but I said that we need to change the focus of our tax breaks. Tax breaks or incentives, traditionally speaking, they need to be replaced by another kind of incentive that I think is a lot more efficient. It's not that what we have now is not efficient, but it doesn't have the same efficacy that we would have if we would have economic incentives. Economic incentives are permanent. They don't have a deadline. They don't depend on a tax reform. They don't depend on taxes. They're actions that the government's municipal, state, or federal government can allow. And actually, even regions that are less favored, I mean, regions where the per capita income is less, through instruments, for example, professional training, attraction of companies to receive investments, because there is a huge difference between a tax break and an investment. A tax break, the company needs to come, install themselves here, produce, and from the sales, once they issue their invoice, and then there's ICMS, and then they're going to get the tax break. In other words, the incentive only happens once the company is installed here and they've made all of the necessary investments. And many companies don't have the capacity or their own resources or guarantees to obtain resources with public financing. In our case here, Banco do Nordeste. And so, in other words, tax breaks to attract investments, except for some exceptions, and we're talking about huge national groups, but for most companies that obtain tax breaks, they could be greater than they've actually been, and what they are today, actually, because they didn't receive investment. They've received incentives, and incentives are after the investment, after the maturity of the operations and sales. That's where you have incentives, and incentives indirectly without any return. So investment is done in that company, and that company doesn't come back to the state. But if we had a economic incentive policy, in other words, attracting companies to allocate specific resources through an investment fund in participation, or even indirectly through ADESE, these companies will be greater. These companies will have greater capacity to produce and a lot more capacity to pay taxes. And taxes are from the state. The taxes are not going to go back to the company through an incentive. It'll come back economic incentives. For example, certain companies do not come to Ceará or to the Northeast, for that matter, because you don't have enough labor. You don't have enough qualified labor because we don't have it. So there's no specific work that's done. I mean, what could exist as an incentive? Any company in the planet, not Brazil, in the planet, that wants to come here, say what you need to come here, and the state will provide. That's it. The state, Ceará, or the state, the federal government will provide to that company what that company needs. They come with investments. What do you need? You need a school that teaches Chinese, because it's a Chinese company that's coming. They don't come here because there's nowhere you can learn Chinese. So you need to have a school to teach Chinese. This company will come here, but they need professionals with specialized knowledge and technology, and we don't have that in our region. So you need to have this. You need to create these conditions through the Federation of Industry, through Senai, through Yale, through the Federal University of Ceará, no matter where. But you need to create the conditions so that the company will come here with this kind of incentive. This kind of incentive is a lot greater. It's more encompassing and produces greater effects than direct tax breaks, the reduction of ICMS, which is important. It's always been very important until now. But we're seeing that we need to create something new. We need to reinvent. And that's why I think an incentive, you need to change the name. It can no longer be a financial incentive and needs to be an economic incentive that can also be financial. The company can have a greater capacity, a more modern, and so it's very important for us to grow, but important to have a strong foundation, and a tax break alone is not enough. Yeah, to add to that, to what Sérgio mentioned, it's really interesting, just to have an idea, even a study from the World Bank and from the UN, and SEFAZ, and they said that last year, 270 billion, 4.5 of the GDP, of taxes that weren't paid. So Brazil didn't levy these taxes, and that represents this percentage of our GDP that just didn't go to the government. This is very relevant. And along the lines of what Sérgio mentioned, perhaps just to add, so we didn't levy almost 5% of the GDP. And what is the control, and what did this bring about, which is a huge question, is there a measurement? I mean, what were the results of all of this? It's not very clear. What we see sometimes is this arm wrestle, those that have more power in Congress, they obtain incentives, and that's what creates for the economy. Now, if we have these resources available in another order, in other words, if we weren't do that, but less tax burden for all, and therefore greater tax levying and better distribution through a fund, for example, that Sérgio mentioned, I also believe that it would be an excellent idea. So, expanding the base, reducing tax burdens, simplifying, and so that these resources could be provided in a different way, even giving credit resources that's better than just not taxing. So that's the conclusion they reached. And the PEC 45 tax reform points towards this idea. I mean, this rupture of incentives. They no longer have space for incentives. In PEC 45, that's how it is. Now, in this new one from Paulo Guedes, we don't know what's going to happen. So when you get into this discussion, many people are going to fight about this. It's very controversial. And I think in this case, he's going little by little with the tax reforms. And let's see how this is going to play out. Yeah, so tax reform, I don't know. PEC 45 is there, and the logic is to decrease incentives, to decrease this practice, and increase the base. Yeah, even from the OECD, they talk a little bit about that. And how to fight against tax litigation. And that's what we're looking into. And what we heard here, this lack of security, this confusion. Anyway, I think we're basically in our closing remarks. 1 minute for each one for your closing remarks. I would like to thank all of you. Excellent ideas. I know this is very controversial. It's very dense, but 60 seconds for each one so that you can share with us your final remarks. Thank you very much once again for the invitation. It's a great honor on my behalf and on behalf of my consulting company. It's great to be present in such an important event, to participate with my colleague Carlos. in such a great debate, a high-level debate, where the ideas flowed, and it was really wonderful. And just to say that I hope that we can reach an agreement, a final conclusion with tax reforms where everyone will come out winning, and not only winning perhaps immediately, but in the long term, the gains can be shared by all. A reform should be as democratic as possible. That's the dream that I hope still in my lifetime to see. Yeah, also I'd like to thank the organizers of Ceará Global, all of my colleagues, excellent debate, possibility to learn with all of you. And also I hope that we can have fiscal justice, tax justice, and we can't have this taxation craziness. So we can attract more business, more investors who will feel attracted with legal security and can do business here and not be so concerned, with simply with tax obligations. And sometimes they even forget about the main business, which is to prosper and to make money. And so I hope and I believe that we're going on the right track. At least we have this debate. We have great projects. And this time, for a long time, we've been talking about tax reforms. But this time, I'm very hopeful that we're going to reach an outcome, a positive outcome. Okay, so we're going to stop here with this panel. Excellent ideas, excellent proposals. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone.
Obrigado, pessoal.